Ms. Miller.
So I'd like to call us back to order. This is regular board meeting and work session here on Tuesday, June 2nd, 2015. And I appreciate Ms. Cook being flexible and allowing us to slide this back an hour in our schedule. It's been kind of crazy, and I'm going to apologize up front. I'm going to do something I never do. I'm going to eat during a board meeting.
Oh, I'm glad you are.
10 years on the Eugene City Council.
Because I had to do a television interview during lunch hour instead of eating lunch. So before my lunch gets absolutely stone cold, seeing the only thing available downstairs was from the deep fryer because they closed everything else down. Deep fried food cold is terrible.
But for what it's just, I had the same. You and I had the identical lunch, Commissioner. It stays hot a long time.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
So you guys, I went across the farmer's market. You got my lunch?
Do they do price
I could do that every day of the week if we had to.
You're so healthy. So we're down to item 12A, which is our work session discussion regarding delegation of authority, selection of an individual to act in the event of an emergency. And we have Steve Dingle and Linda Cook here. And I really appreciate the emails that Mr. Bokohysky forwarded us from other county administrators about their process for delegation of authority. Really important issue, but I'm going to turn this over to Steve and Linda to educate us.
Well, part of the education will come from Ms. Cook. But I think the decision points, just to sort of reset this for everybody, you recall we did the exercise. And that was incident command place?
Emergency Operations Center Training.
Okay.
Is that what we're referring to with the commissioners?
Incident command structure.
Incident command structure.
ICS, the ICS training and the EOC training. We've had two.
And so I think what it pointed out was that we needed, or it would be a good idea to make some decisions ahead of time. And we thought of the decision, and for example, we talked about the decision to use the Forest Work Camp last year during the wildfire season, to sort of have a process in place. So the way that I see this is they're along the lines of some of the material that examples that Steve did forwarded, which would create essentially kind of a line of succession, and it would, and also make sure it was consistent with our emergency operation plan. And then the thing that actually, one of the other things that initially sparked this was, sparked is probably a bad word, provoked this was was Commissioner Bozovich forwarding the material that you and I believe Mr. you and Commissioner Stewart went to with the fire marshal. And so we can do some of that ahead of time where the board would have the authority, and I've actually, I was going to tell you, Linda, I had my person convert this to Word,
nice.
the order, so
okay.
We can actually, the board can actually make decisions where we could get some of that pre-done, so that it would be very easy to declare, to make the necessary steps to declare that. I mean, really, quite frankly, there's only a couple of things that you can't know ahead of time, like which is where it is,
right,
and what it's called. But essentially, we could do the other steps. And I thought listening, I found it very helpful. And I know it's been a while since we're at that training, but I thought there were really good conversations around during that. It was clear that people had sort of different views. As we were talking about, well, I'd expect this to happen, or I'd be okay with this person making that call. I just thought this would be a great place, especially with Linda's expertise, to talk those things through and then memorialize them, and that way they'll just happen automatically, and sort of the poor situation that Commissioner Farr was kind of caught in last year won't occur. We've already made the decision about what's going to happen. As we go through these, we can make some decision points. I know there's some specific things with Linda, but I think you as the board have to, whoever you delegate that authority to, the individual, you need to kind of decide on what the sort of parameters of those are. And I was amazed when, and I forget the gentleman's name who did our training. He was excellent. At any rate, he made a very good point, which Mr. Mokrohiski could quickly exceed his financial authority in an emergency. I mean, not that way, just if someone came and asked him to do certain things that needed to be done, he could quickly be over his authority. So that's that's what I think you really need to decide in terms of who it's going to be and then what the boundaries of their, authority is. Is it going to be time? Like, he has, or if he makes Steve the first person in line that he has, he can operate for 2 days or 3 days, or you can put a money cap on it, like he can spend up to $500,000, whatever it is. I think that that's the way to go. I personally think the time thing makes sense because I think kind of the last thing that you're going to want him doing in an emergency is carrying around a calculator trying to figure out how much money he's spending. I think you hired him as your administrator. You trust his judgment to act for you for 2 or 3 days in an emergency or whatever until you get the board together. Maybe it's 48 hours. I don't know. A weekend would seem to be the time. So those are just some decision points. And want to jump in?
Sure.
I have a question real quickly. So, in the line of authority, it's my understanding that in the county, the sheriff becomes the chief emergency officer. Is this how it works? Or is it just in unincorporated Lane County? Or is it for the entire county, including the cities? Because it is my understanding that unless, if I can say for the city of Springfield, the fire chief fills that role, and then, of course, coordinates with the police chief in case that's an issue that comes up. So how does that line work? I mean, because if a situation happens within a city, like let's say it's a flood, and the flood's running through the city and you need to call in for emergency management, isn't the sheriff then become the point person regardless if it's in the city jurisdiction or not?
Well, let me frame what you're describing just a little bit differently.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect.
So, no law enforcement agency is going to step in and take over for another law enforcement agency.
Right.
True for fire, true for public works. So they will operate under mutual aid, right?
Right.
So there's never a time when another jurisdiction steps in for another. Now, what you're referring to is if there is some type of major emergency and it is beyond the ability of the local jurisdiction. Let's use the flood. The flood starts in Springfield and it starts expanding, and the waters are getting deeper and it's expanding across city lines, and the city of Springfield says, we can't do this, we need help. The city of Springfield does an emergency declaration. It comes to the county. The county looks at it and says, okay, have we brought all of our resources to the table that we can to help the city of Springfield cope with that emergency? And if it turns out that we don't have any further ability to help them, then we do an emergency declaration or disaster declaration. We forward that to the governor's office and we say, we've got X number of homes flooding, this many injuries, this many deaths. We've thrown all of these resources out at the situation. We list those out and we tell them we need an emergency declaration and we need resources from the state. And so then the state looks at it and they say, okay, let's start brokering our resources. Maybe they send in the National Guard. Maybe they've got some fire teams from outside the area that are, believe it or not, fire teams are starting to help a lot in flood situations. So maybe they've got some resources to bring into Lane County. And if they get their resources exhausted, then they call in for federal help. So it's city, county, state, federal agencies, and it goes up the chain in that regard. So does that answer
It does.
your question?
So that's perfect. I just remember the 96 floods was where the flood was a little bit where the sheriff's department seemed to play, from an emergency officer standpoint, played a fairly significant role in probably coordinating as much as anything with all the different jurisdictions, because that was affecting all of us. We were all being affected.
Okay, so that dynamic that you're referring to is the emergency response is the responsibility of the Board of County Commissioners, and at some point in the county's history, they delegated that authority to the sheriff to be the director of emergency management. And so whenever there's an emergency that happens in Lane County, the sheriff is the emergency management director. He's the emergency management director at all times, and he has appointed me as an emergency manager.
Thank you.
But what, excuse me, kind of what we're talking about today, though, is that when there's a situation that happens fairly quickly and there needs to be some assistance, and we can't draw the board together for an emergency meeting to get formal authority. Case in point, the Swanson Superior Middle up in Springfield, it's my understanding in talking with Covert Fire Chief that was one that was very close to calling in, and they had every available fire department there working on that, and they were very close to calling in for additional help. Well, in that instance, it might have been this fire is going to jump the river and it's going to go into Mount Vista, and the administrator's probably going to have to say how can deploy assistance or try to stop it before it gets into City Loop or something. So those are instances where you need to be able to give somebody the authority, and then I think you come back and double back when you have the appropriate time and say, okay, we want to continue to play this role, this is the cost and everything else, and then get formal board authority to do it. And I know that the information is kind of centric to fire, and fire is probably on our mind because of the drought, if the thing's taking place. I just wanted to share this can be for any type of emergency. So we talked a little bit about flood, it could be earthquake, it could be essentially anything that we need to draw assistance.
And that's a really great point, because when I thought it would make more sense, and I want to make sure that that whatever you do is consistent with what Linda did, that has been in her plan. But I thought it made sense to make it a generic thing for that first initial part, rather than have. I know that I looked at the one that was forwarded by Steve from. It is Douglas County, isn't it? Yeah. Coincidental, but Douglas County, and they seem to have ones for different events. Did I read that right? Like they say, okay, so they hereby declare for fire, for this, for that. And I don't know if there's a reason to at least when it comes to that initial generic authority to respond, I don't know if there's a reason to make them to do different ones for different things. I think you're suggesting that it just be, that essentially an emergency be defined, and that he give, that if you pick Steve, that he have a certain amount of authority for a certain period of time to respond to that.
I have a thought on that. I unfortunately have been out and unable to read the email dialogues on the delegations that Steve copied me on. I'm going to venture a guess why there are different lines of authority or lines of delegations of authority depending on different circumstances, is because just as I have been listening to this conversation, we've talked about the middle of the night call regarding the forest work camp. We talked about some of the unprotected lands that was in discussion with Commissioner Bozovich. We talked about some of the things we learned through the Blue Cell training, as well as this recent mill fire. When I take notes on this, what I pick up on is that there were different needs that will call for different responses. We had the need to use county facilities to help another agency. Okay, so that was the forest work camp. It was, we got the call, but that wasn't our facility to give authority to use. So there is bringing the resources. Somebody needs to have the authority to commit county resources to helping with an emergency situation. When you talk about unprotected lands, such as Mount Pisgah, maybe spilling over into a populated area, I brought you some maps. We have unprotected lands in Lane County, meaning they are not protected by a local fire agency, a state or federal fire agency. These are folks that have chosen to live in a rural area without fire protection. They are kind of sandwiched in between maybe a fire district and Oregon Department of Forestry. They put themselves in a little bit of a dicey situation, but they're in an unprotected area. In that case, the thought that occurs to me is if there's a major fire raging you've got the fire service agencies on hand, you have the sheriff's office already on hand, ready and prepared to evacuate people, but then the dilemma comes up, you know what, this fire is starting to bud up, and it could be in the middle of the night, or it could be, 8 o'clock on a Monday morning. There's no clue when these things might happen, but it's butting up against some homes that are unprotected, and there needs to be a decision that as quickly as we can delegate the authority to the nearest fire district to go ahead and fight that fire, and we would need to participate in a Conflagration Act declaration. I don't know how familiar you are with that process, but it's very similar to a disaster declaration, but it's where you're saying we don't have any more local resources to fight this fire, so we need to do a conflagration declaration, get the state fire marshal resources in, get a state team in, we need some help. In that situation, it would seem to me, now I have to confess I haven't run this by the sheriff yet, so we want to probably think about this more, but in that situation, if I were you, I would want the sheriff to have the authority to delegate to the fire department, okay, I'm standing here side by side, I see what's happening here, I will sign this document so that you can get a Conflagration Act declaration to the state and bring in some state resources post haste. Just a thought, okay, just based on how I've seen things play out. When it comes to, we've had a major earthquake, and we're needing to bring in massive amounts of earth-moving equipment, or we need to bring in special teams that are going to cost us a ton of money, that becomes a financial issue, and that to me would make sense that a county administrator would have the authority to lift or waive or whatever, and as you learn in the training, for a finite period of time. For 5 days or for 3 days, the county administrator, we've invoked our emergency operations plan, and the authorities in the emergency operations plan gives your county administrator 5 days to make financial decisions up to $500,000 for 36 hours. I don't know how to frame it, but that's very different from being in the thick of a fire when you need to bring in outside resources right away to fight unprotected lands, because we know nobody in the county is employed by the county to fight fires, and it's very different from authorizing the use of facilities. So I didn't read the Douglas County. I don't know how they did it there, but I do see that there are different situations that warrant considering.
So what is the chain of command in the current plan in terms of
Sheriff's command staff.
So
It's the sheriff. Now, we have not looked at delegation of authorities in the past. The sheriff is the guy in charge, and if he's unavailable or detained, then it becomes the sheriff, chief deputy, police services captain, and then I don't know if it's me or the police services lieutenant. I think it's 5 or 6 deep.
But that's the chain of command for the operational response to incident.
That's right.
And I don't think that's really what the board is considering here. We're not talking about the emergency management of an incident. We're talking about the allocation of resources, whether those resources be financial or land or equipment, for a short period of time. If we had an incident that happened late on a Friday and we couldn't get 3 commissioners together in an emergency meeting, and it was going to take 3-5 days or whatever until we did that, what do we do in the meantime? So I think that's what, I'm thinking even back on the Forest Work Camp incident. I don't know. It's a little unclear to me. If anyone had the authority to authorize the use, it would have been, if any one person had the authority, it would have been the administrator, right?
I would think so. Right.
And if the administrator didn't have the authority, I guess I still don't really know if the administrator has the authority to allow for use of property or use of equipment for a short duration of time in response to emergency, or if that's something that rests. It's clear the administrator has the authority to allocate resources up to $100,000 for individual expenses, up to $100,000. the question is, does that
I
also
think that-
apply as it relates to land and equipment and other?
I think that the strict answer is that I think that you as the non-elected individual that's at the top of the organization have the authority to use county resources up to your authority. And I think that was part of the concern, which is that you could get there very quickly. You could hit the end of your authority long before you could talk to them. I mean, again, I think the example that our trainer gave was really pretty good. You know, and I think that's kind of what we're getting at here is, so let's say that the sheriff says, we need every truck that Public Works has and the crews over here, or whatever. Let's just say that we did that, and we looked at that and said, oh crap, that's going to cost that's $150,000. That would be above your authority unless they've been pre-delegated. And that's the kind of authority that they're talking about, which is someone, because the sheriff doesn't have that authority, right, to go and say, tell Public Works to bring all their...
Well, I'm not sure. I hear what you're saying, and you just happen to pick on a really dicey example. My preference would be to be looking at an example where we already have all the Public Works crews out there, and now we need to go to an outside contractor, and that's going to tap us out. Because the assumption is that if we've got a massive incident that we're dealing with, all county resources have an obligation to be out there. We have these, severe winter storms, every other year, and they have their multi-million-dollar storm fund, and good thing they do, and we try to get them 75% of it back when we have a declaration. So I think there's this assumption that the resources are going to be expended no matter what at the county level. It's when we go to that contractor and say, we need, 5 tractors and 6 crews to run them around, around the block or whatever.
And I think-
that's where that $150,000 gets burned through in no time flat.
Right, and what I was going to say is the difference with when we, like, for example, the storm fund, the board has, the board has authorized that because, there's some authority there because it's, when Public Works came and made their budget presentation, they said, this much money is set aside for emergency storm response. I think what we're trying to do is, at least what I'm trying to do is, because I have a sneaking suspicion that if there was ever to be a disagreement, then people would be calling me on my phone, and I'd have all these people going, I think I've got this power, I think I've got that power. So what I think we're trying to do is talk through, how would this work? So my suggestion, that's what I'm saying, is that if the board is comfortable, they could delegate to Steve, and then you could go down to acting county administrator if he's unavailable. I'd go down a couple different things. But they could be that person if there wasn't something already. Like I'm trying to pick an example of where they wouldn't have pre-done the storm thing. Like I think the earthquake is a good one. Okay,
Right.
so there's an earthquake, and then for whatever reason, the sheriff comes and activates the plan, and the sheriff says, "Oh my goodness, I need to do this." In other words, it would be taking
5 water trucks would kill us.
yeah, or whatever, something like that.
Right.
And we all agree it's above Steve's authorization. What I think I'd like them to do is, as a policy, say, you know what, we're comfortable with this. We're going to delegate to our county administrator or his designee, if he's not available, the acting county administrator, the authority to essentially act for 48 hours. So that they don't have time to get these folks together. The sheriff says, I need these 15 minutes ago. And it's going to cost more than $150,000. Steve goes, I can do this because we've talked about it, the board's given me that authority.
I agree.
And it's illegal. It's the same thing with your contractor. Exactly the same thing, which is it can only be done, and it would require the commitment on the part of the county to commit something greater than his authority.
Right.
Then the board would say, Steve can legally sign that contract because he's been authorized to act in an emergency in all events up, whatever it is, 48 hours or whatever, no period of time you pick. And then that way, it's all taken care of ahead of time. There is no question about the legality of it. That's what I worry about, is in that situation is, there'll probably be some stupid lawyer sitting there going, hey, wait a minute, how much is this going to cost? I don't know if we can really sign that contract.
Right.
You actually don't have authority, and you can't act with the parent authority. Stand there doing everything. There'll be a few living after the apocalypse, so just get used to it.
Just sort things out.
You're like cockroaches.
Yes, they're hard to kill. So that's what came up during this, is I thought it would be good for them to talk this out. They could have that discussion as a matter of policy. They could delegate that, and then it would be clear that, for example, in any emergency, the sheriff would be taught. I thought it would make his job easier, because there would be no, do I call the chair? Do I call the vice chair? Who do I call?
Right.
We call
The county
Steve,
administrator.
and then Steve, as the county administrator, can make those decisions. And I assume that one of the first things that I would recommend with this authority would be that he immediately begin organizing or calling an emergency meeting of the board. If that's like, once you get this first thing, you put Diane in charge of doing that, whoever your assistant is, and you start answering the thing, but that there would be an emergency board meeting convened within 48 hours or something.
I've got Commissioner Stewart and Commissioner Lycan. Did your question get answered?
Pass my information, thanks.
Okay. So do you have a question?
So only really it pertains to Douglas County, and I think you may have to look into that a little bit more. The reason why is because Douglas County actually assumes a lot of the things the city would handle. And like, for instance, I'm just going to throw planning out there. So you get your permits from the city of Roseburg, but actually all the structural permitting, the electrical, the plumbing, everything actually comes from Douglas County, whether you build in Roseburg or not. And so, because the cities, I think it's cities plural, Roseburg's the big city and it has about 25,000 people. They cede so much of that to Douglas County. So it'd be kind of interesting to find out, that whole dynamic there. I don't know if this pertains to emergency management, but I'm going to guess it probably does, if they're going to cede a lot of the planning over to Douglas County as well. So I think it'd be interesting just to find that out. But I think where this discussion, I'd agree with Faye. I had some other questions, but they've been answered, so I'm good. But the only thing I would suggest is just kind of follow up on that, on the Douglas County aspect, and find out how much authority they have, even within whether it's rural or urban areas of the county.
So what I'm hearing in this discussion, I'm going to throw one in, is I'm guessing that the permitting process is for the purpose of expediting permits. We need to rebuild quickly, or we need to build in a way that's normally not permitted to prevent future damages, or it's imminent. You have to do something to waive a permit to mitigate another imminent tragedy from happening, a secondary tragedy. I'm hearing spending authorization, and then I'd also, since we're on the subject, talk about imposing curfews, so that we would have somebody with the authority to be able to come out and say, okay, no one is allowed on the street after 10 p.m. because we're doing massive search and rescue through the night, trying to get people out of collapsed buildings, that kind of thing, and trying to prevent looting, etc.
So the threshold question would be, what would, we've thrown around the term emergency, whatever, what would be the triggering event? And I'd like to have as much, just for ease of operation, I'd like to have as much symmetry between that definition and your delegation. You would not want to end up in a situation where there was some difference between the emergency, the definition of emergency that you gave to Steve, as opposed to when the sheriff says there's an emergency.
That's a very interesting question, because, looking at some of the other counties, in their ordinance, in their code, they basically say the board declares the emergency. So, and if the board's not available, their designee, which in the case of Hood River is the county administrator, or that person's designee. It seems to me that, at the moment of an emergency, I remember when the tsunami warning came in the middle of the night, I missed the call. The sheriff tried to contact me. I didn't hear the phone. It was one of those, the phone just did not wake me that night. Wake up in the morning, all sorts of text messages and stuff like that.
Are you alive?
But so the question is for me, it's not so much trying to define the emergency, because Julie and I can be able to sit here and propose what that next emergency is. There's all sorts of industrial issues that could get that, accidents, trains, you name it, that could become an emergency. It's who has the authority for the county to say, okay, we're in an emergency now, and then start that 48-hour clock running to where we have to bring the board together to officially confirm that, yes, it's an emergency, and you have authority to spend money.
That's a distinction, though, that the board is still always going to be the entity that officially declares an emergency.
Right.
The sheriff, or if they have a wildland fire or another event where we're going to have agencies that are going to be responding to an imminent threat or issue, and we'll allocate resources until the board has the ability to convene and formally declare that emergency, which is one of the reasons that in Douglas County, Nevada, they had several different declarations drafted, so that it was, when they showed up, it was just like, we have a fire, pick the fire one. We have a flood, pick the flood. It wasn't people scurrying around having to type. They actually had some incidences where they had printed one off and it said flood, and it was actually a fire event. And so then they had to go back and they said, enough of that. Let's just be clear. Let's have them all pre-drafted. And it's difficult enough to get everyone in the room together. Once you're in the room together, it's very clear what's being approved. So I think that's an important thing to know, that the board is always going to be the entity that will formally make that designation. You're talking about the potential of delegating certain limited authorities to certain individuals in certain instances.
Well,
And actually, by saying that, I mean, like when you read that, that setup that the one you described in Hood River, I mean, technically, there has been a legal delegation from the board, by the board's actually delegated authority to the administrator, their authority to declare an emergency to the administrator.
Right.
So
So basically, it's very clear here. The board may declare a state of emergency. Blah blah blah. It says time is of the essence. The chair or his successor pursuant, they have a succession list in there. It may declare the state of emergency. However, a majority of the board must adopt a declaration at the first available opportunity. That seems, as simple as having that written into code and adopted by us will protect Steve if he gets that midnight tsunami warning call where he decides to authorize a state of emergency to evacuate Florence and surrounding Dune City and surrounding areas. That in conjunction with in consultation with the sheriff, and whether it's Steve, it could be that we go Sheriff Steve or something like that. I'm not saying where the and I don't even know if the chair should be in there. Ultimately, though, at the first opportunity, the board can be brought together. We're the authority that has the right to declare an emergency in the county. I mean, that's a very clear statute in Oregon, but having language written like this in code, and not trying to be specific to any particular emergency. And then secondary to the declaration of an emergency, and having that clearly spelled out in advance that Steve has the authority, if he can't get a majority of the board together, to declare an emergency. Or even the sheriff. Then there's also the authority to allocate resources that goes along with that. It would be a secondary portion of that we have pre-delegated. Once that declaration is made, that then he has a 72-hour clock where he can spend and allocate resources towards that emergency without board approval.
And I'm assuming that, and I think that's...
If we had those two things, it deals with any emergency that might come up. We don't need to define it. We don't need, the only other exception is the actual declaration. Now, getting to ask for a state of emergency where we're asking for help outside of the county. That's a different
Right.
level of request that can flag a
Well, and that's a
conflagration.
That is
Big fire.
Can I offer something here? I'm really, I understand that, I'm starting to understand with every passing year how complicated emergency management is to tease out. But I want to go ahead and use the everyday examples that we are all familiar with to try to get a little bit of clarity around what I think is really needed versus what is not. So we're not keeping with your desire to keep it simple and straightforward and kind of an all hazards. What happened with the forest work camp, that was, no aspect of that was an emergency. Oregon Department of Forestry needed a facility in the middle of the night. They were calling in a panic. They wanted to get as far ahead of the curve as they could. No aspect of that was an emergency. That was, we never expected that to happen. We weren't able to get a hold of the people that we needed, and that was not an emergency. It was, in their own view of the world, there was some panic on the side of trying to set up a forest work camp.
It was not presented as not an emergency.
Okay, so this is what I'm trying to help kind of tease out. That was some people feeling a great deal of anxiety and a sense of that was a sense of urgency, not an emergency. Okay, when we had the distant tsunami that I think that was in January 2012, and the coast decided to go ahead and evacuate. Even that was not an emergency. It was the police and fire chief over on the coast in contact with me and the sheriff and the 911 dispatch center, and they were making their own decisions amongst themselves. Do we need to evacuate this area? And the only information we had, we said, okay, let's pull the trigger, let's evacuate. That was not an emergency because there had been no deaths, no injuries, nothing. I like to go back to Steve's suggestion that we tie whatever authorities we're discussing here today back to the emergency operations plan, because in the emergency operations plan, you'll see, it'll come before you in the next few weeks, there are 3 levels of an emergency. There's level 3, which is the lowest level of emergency. It's taxing our resources, we're struggling, but it looks like we're going to be able to handle it. Level 2 is, you know what, we're calling in some mutual aid, but I still think we can handle it at the local level. Level 3 is, this is outside of our realm to cope. My suggestion would be that these special authorities that you want to invoke, the expanded spending limits, the limited duration expansion of spending limits, maybe you want to impose some curfews, maybe you want to expedite permitting processes, that those be reserved for when the sheriff has made the determination through assessment of the situation that we need to activate the emergency operations plan in response to a level 2 or level 3 emergency. And with the invoking of the plan, then you automatically invoke the special rules and authorities. To me, it can be an everyday authority that you can offer up county resources. We own them, we control them. I don't see any, and forgive me if I'm completely mistaken, but on the forest work camp issue, that was totally within the purview of authority for the appropriate person at the county to go ahead and do that. The evacuation on the coast, that was completely within the purview of authority for the chiefs that made that decision. Where it gets really dicey and we really need the help is when we're starting to just tap out our resources and we're at that level 2 or level 3 emergency.
Well, I would say that there is even with the what I would call routine mutual aid thing, Steve still has limited authority. I mean, he can't, if that were to go over $100,000, it would exceed his authority. And so part of it too, for me, would be clarifying up front. The nice part is that he doesn't have to sit around and, like, for example, right now, he comes to me, my first question would be, well, gee, how much is this gonna, how much are you spending? Well, I don't know, the camp's empty, I don't know. So that would be, I think there's value in just saying that he can respond to a request for mutual assistance, even below that level.
Right.
And then I do think it would make sense to run these other two things parallel to the existing process. You'd want to make sure that they went together, that they didn't conflict.
And that when we invoke the emergency operations plan, it means something. It means
No,
something to the
it means-
response community, it means something to county
I mean, it's
government in
really
terms
bad.
of the authorities that automatically get invoked.
Because, as a practical thing, I think that I cannot imagine with the personalities of the people who are currently in these key positions that there wouldn't be cooperation between Steve and the sheriff.
It's amazing the cooperation that happens during emergencies.
Right.
It's like every difference anybody ever held just evaporates.
But I am an attorney, so...
Yeah, and that's...
Unless you're dealing with an attorney.
Yeah.
Yeah, but, it just, I don't think there were real disagreements when I watched that exercise, but I did see differences, and it just seems like it would be so much more efficient, it would make things, it would avoid any potential pitfalls if that were taken care of ahead of time. And then each year, when your plan comes up, each individual board, I was going to suggest you'd use that as the trigger for reviewing, are we still comfortable with the authority that we've delegated, the people that are in the chain of command, adopting that, it all goes together sort of seamlessly at that point.
My only concern, and I completely agree, my only concern would be that we be very careful and review this very clearly or carefully so that we don't inadvertently or unintentionally undermine an authority that already exists and works perfectly because we've created this new authority that we thought we needed and didn't know was already covered.
No, that's
So
exactly
what I'm
that's why you're,
thinking.
I 100% agree. That's kind of my nightmare is that we would go along in good faith and set up this process, and then at step 2 or 3, which we're only going to discover in the middle of, something, it's like, oh, geez, the board's thought and process is directly in contradiction with something else.
Right.
In other words, and then when I would say not only just the emergency plan, but the way that it works in the real world. In other words, that's going to set up a potential issue. My only experience with emergencies is not, been with the big disasters, but I have watched the fights over jurisdictional turf at 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning when I was deputy DA. I've had to referee more than my share knows. And trust me, the process where we went back afterwards and sat down and said, got the players at the table and said, are we all in agreement that this is what's going to happen this time? It was so much easier, so much better.
Yeah, I
Because
absolutely
we've talked
think
it
this is the
through.
right thing to do.
We've talked it
Yeah.
through. The heat of the moment is not the time to be
Right.
debating. And you never know who's, again, there's some people that, I found in my experience with, like different directors and things like that, people have different thresholds. And so, I can see where, somebody might be very reluctant. I don't think Steve falls into this category, but someone might be real reluctant. Oh, gosh, I'm just not comfortable doing that. Wow, that just doesn't, I don't know that I have that authority. Whereas here, it'll be clear, so.
Right.
But I do think that the one and then separate and apart, so I started to hold this up, we can do, that's this sort of special process for this. And really, I think we want to keep it in those two realms, the sort of generic process that we run in tandem. I like your idea of by the way, the level 2 and level 3, it's consistent with that, and then we could, Steve, then we would have in all other emergency type situations or requests for mutual assistance, the county administrator is delegated to do this.
Yeah, the mutual assistance piece is a good catch. I hadn't thought about that one.
Because that sounds like that's what it was with the force camp.
Right.
That's it.
So, Linda, I think that conversation, I think, is really important because from my perspective, what I don't want to do is get in the way as an elected official, as a commissioner. And so I'm guessing it was over a decade ago. But there was a fire in Mount Pisgah. And actually, that was Springfield Fire and Life Safety. But there was a mutual aid because I do know at that point in time, ODFW was on call if they need to bring a helicopter in. But at the time, they didn't need to because so Springfield Fire and Life Safety was actually fighting fire on Mount Pisgah, but all was aware And I got the call as mayor after the fact that the neighbor almost had it out, oh, by the way, and just let us know that in a sense that, well, they affected quickly, but, you know, this was Springfield Facilities actually working the fire on Mount Pisgah, but the mutual aid piece was in place. So obviously, I'm guessing the sheriff obviously knew. I don't know who knew, but like I said, I do know that ODF&W, they were on call in case they needed to bring a helicopter in. So there was that coordination that was there. I mean, that was actually outstanding to watch. It was incredible.
Yeah, they do that as a normal course of business.
Yeah. I just don't want to be in the way.
Right.
That's the thing. So.
Yeah, and I don't know, and you know, maybe everybody knows this already, but just in case someone doesn't, all law enforcement agencies have mutual aid agreements in place where they backfill for each other when somebody's got a major incident coming in. That is true with fire service agencies, and it's also true with Public Works. Public Works, I think, actually, theirs is statewide. So there are gobs of mutual aid agreements out there already. So these agencies that are doing this kind of work are already poised to help without any type of political or government authority to do that. It's already in place. They have mutual aid agreements, and they know who's going to reimburse who for what expenses or not. Maybe they're going to say, we're not going to charge you back for this, and that's what we saw happen at the Deception Complex fire. We had a ton of resources up there last summer.
Well, the one thing I was going to say is that we talk about being comfortable with the authority. One of the things I also want to make sure of is that our folks are covered, because we have these statutes in Oregon that say that public officials that spend money without proper authorization are personally liable. I would hate to see someone come in because they disagree. A good example was with the road fund. That was the claim that was brought against the board and the sheriff. Somebody, in that case it was a union, but someone could come in and go, where did Mocha High School get off spending this amount? Even if you had a mutual aid agreement, someone would say, he didn't have authority to spend $250,000.
That's right.
So therefore, I'm going to bring a lawsuit for him to repay personally $250,000. So that's the other layer to this is I want to make sure that everybody's covered, because while they may have that mutual aid agreement, they're still going to be bound by their spending limitations.
That's right.
I'd hate to see somebody come in and who is dissatisfied with the outcome of the result and make a claim. I'm sorry, I know you have a question.
My question is about if you can't get the board together. We found this out in our little exercise down there, right? If you can't get the board together, or you can't get a majority of the board together, then you're going to build into this document somebody else gets to make the decision that it's an emergency. And my question is, when does the board then, when it does get together, if it can get together, does it have the right then to make those decisions and thus immunize the person that's been appointed to handle things until such time as the board gets together? Is that a transfer back, or is it a one-way thing? Just had this tsunami, there's water pounding the coast, it's a huge emergency, the commissioners are gone, we don't know if they're ever going to come back or ever put them together as a group.
Put them on a boat,
and so now the sheriff's in charge, and the sheriff's still in charge. 5 years later, the sheriff's still in charge. In other words, when does it come back to the board, and is there a length of time that we would presume that, sorry to say it, we're not coming back from this particular emergency, that we're goners and you're going to have to do something else and transfer it back to the board?
Couple of things. Now, I'm going to kind of go, some of this is a little bit off point, but I will get to your point, I promise. When we see it coming, I try to start getting information out to the commissioners, and I remember there was one incident where I actually wanted to know what your whereabouts and availability was going to be over the next several days. So we try to mitigate that issue and try to assess ahead of time, okay, who might be difficult getting a hold of, and not only do you have to gather physically, that's not your only option, we can also gather over the telephone. Okay. Now, let's say we can't get a quorum together, and you had Commissioner Sorensen and Stewart and the sheriff get together and say, you know what, we've got to declare it an emergency. Let's just make it happen. And it's totally out of whack with what we say we were going to do. Actually, it's not out of whack. It would just be consistent with the succession of authority. Once you make that declaration, it's done. That declaration is done. And if you've got the spending limits already...
You can't come back in 3 hours and go, now we have the whole board together, no emergency.
No, and in fact, you wouldn't want to do that, because there's never a harm in declaring an emergency, but there can be significant harm in not declaring an emergency. So it's almost like no harm, no foul. So once you make that declaration, it's gone through. I suppose you could, rescind it. I don't know of anybody that ever has. But if something's that dicey to where anybody thought at one time that we needed to do it, we're better off just leaving it out there, because there's a whole other boring story that I could tell you about what you have to do to validate that declaration after the fact. So it may be that we do all this validation and it doesn't stand anyway. So anyway, that declaration goes, and it's a done deal for all intents and purposes. If you've got these policies in place ahead of time, they're already time-bound, and once the commissioners are convenable, we start engaging the policymakers, keeping them informed and asking them for direction forward.
And I, to your point, Commissioner Swanson, what I would expect is there might be times where I could envision one of the actions that the board would take once they were convening. They would get a report from what's going on. They might say, keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah, or they might say, why don't we stand down on that?
Yeah, we'll meet again in 2 days, but until then, you have the authority we granted to you to handle this initially, to keep going with what you're doing. That could easily be one outcome.
Right, and it's in our best interest in the response community to make sure that you're well informed and that you're in agreement. The last thing we want is to have gone down a path only later for you to all be very upset. Not a good thing.
That's how quick it happens. I just sent a message to everybody, this is not an emergency. That's how quickly we can get a hold of the board.
That was good.
Did you really?
I did. I don't have Pete's cell phone number, so.
Well, see, now that was one thing that we found out. One thing we found out at the thing is that we needed to have...
And I know at least 2 people looked at it right away. I did.
We need to have at least to make sure we have everybody's cell phones. And so I guess we know what our decision points are, right?
I think so. I'm hearing spending limits and
Or time.
time-bound spending limits, right?
There's an amount threshold and then there's a duration.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking that my recommendation would, it's later the board's decision, but I'd really feel...
Time is more, rather than trying to... Because I know whoever your director of, you've got your EOC open up, and you've got your person that's doing your, keeping track of your finances. Bills aren't all coming in the moment.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So how does he know when he's exceeded his financial authority?
That's why
Okay.
the time is
You're right. You're right.
That's one less thing Steve has to worry about in this thing, is have
I'm failing to remember
somebody
the name of that.
doing a running total. Where am I at?
Finance chief?
And then that also begs the question, what would happen? What if it was 5 hours into it and you hit spending authority, and now what? Does it just grind to a halt because he's hit his authority? So I think that if you trust the administrator, the time thing seems to build in the flexibility that we need. And quite frankly, I think we learned from the last thing is it's going to be pretty easy or not pretty easy. Given technology today, we're in a lot better position than we might have been 20 years ago about getting you together.
Well, Steve, the question has been is, how valid is that text message that I just sent? Legally, can we say, Steve says, I need $500K more, this is why, and then 4 of us say, okay.
Well, you don't have, you'd have to be doing it, you'd have to be doing like an emergency, it would have to be like an emergency meeting, you'd have to have that emergency thing, I think.
There'd have to be some process that has been pre-approved to do it.
Yeah, I don't think you could, I don't think we're ready to go to virtual meetings by text.
Although, I will say, though, if it's a major earthquake and that's the only thing working, that could save our bacon. You know, I mean, look at what happened in Hurricane Katrina. It could be a way to convene people. I mean, if you could send out and ping everybody and everybody said, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, to group
Yeah, I'm just trying to, I'd have to grind it through the public meetings. I think they could agree to that. I just would want to lay that up against the public meetings law.
That's my question, is there something they can do to look into it to see if we can legally do
Yeah, because
something?
quite often in an emergency, and it's been tested over and over again, voice service dies because of the amount of people trying to reach loved ones to find out. But text, because it's such a small amount of data, compact, is still one way you can communicate. And they tell you over and over again in emergency preparedness, be ready to communicate by text because you probably will not have voice in a major emergency.
In the Army, we used to have authentication, and on a CEOI, that everybody would have what the authentication code was for that moment. We have those little fob things that some of us carry around. But there's authentication capability. It's not even technology, it's just...
I would even accept
Do
it,
you
yes.
have a question?
Hey, there's a pass.
In terms of the current board order or ordinance in place about the county administrator's authority, is that being overridden by this decision?
Yeah, what I would recommend is that there be an acknowledgement of that, so the order, when you do it, would acknowledge that under, in code, currently, the administrator ordinarily has authority to spend $100,000. The board recognizes that this is an insufficient figure depending on the nature of the emergency, and hereby, in these limited circumstances, authorizes the
It does
county administrator
kind of raise an interesting problem of how, this is not a problem the federal government has, right? They don't have this limitation on spending that is tied to revenue. We do.
Right.
So what can we do to say we'll do what we can within our authority, as opposed to we'll do everything we can and spend all the money we have on this emergency, and the adopted budget and the other priorities that we have, we're just going to have to wait because rescuing that cat is just too darn important.
I'm really glad you're asking that question because that maps right back to the importance of only activating these authorities if you're at a level 2 or level 3 and likely to get a disaster declaration that gets you 75% reimbursement.
Oh, okay.
So you really want to be careful on some of these types of, you really want to make a good, well-reasoned decision about when you're going to invoke the EOP and invoke those special authorities. Because if we can survive, maybe we don't want to spend $200,000 on contractors, and we would rather spend 6 months repairing things. In other words, maybe we can afford time, but we can't afford cash because for some reason this meteorite only hit Lane County, and we don't have the state's threshold for reaching a disaster declaration. So consequently, we probably shouldn't go ahead and authorize that huge spending limit. So that is a good point for us to keep in mind.
But to your point, Commissioner, I think the answer would be that you can only give what you've got, in terms of delegating your authority. So if you have, whatever home rule, constitutional, statutory, or other self-imposed limitations that you put on yourself, that's what's going to go with whatever you give to Steve.
Can you take road fund money and use it to save people? Or you have to use road fund
That
money?
is so outside my area of expertise.
That's a great question.
Yeah,
We have $10 million.
That's one of those
a lot of
questions
money.
where you might have somebody who.
And that was one of the technicalities with the request to use the forest work camp. That has a land use restriction.
Right.
It's only supposed to be used for correctional. stuff. And turning it over to a fire agency to use as a temporary forest camp may not have actually matched what we have approval from the state to use it for. And that's there's always going to be that in the moment, yes,
Right.
there's a statutory restriction, but can we deal with that later?
Right, and I would say that that's a great question, because there are going to be different levels of those conflicts. The one that Commissioner Sorensen raised, the prohibition on the road fund is constitutional.
In the previous fire out on the Saisla River, we specifically had the State Department of Corrections put their firefighting inmates at the Forest Work Camp, so we were using it for correction purposes, because that issue came up. Can't use it for firefighting purposes, but you can use it for corrections purposes, since the crew that they were using was from the State Department of Corrections. They were inmates. They're also fighting a forest fire. Okay.
Well, I also wonder, and I don't know if I'm just opening a can of worms, but it'd be interesting if a long-term project would be to look at all of our county-owned facilities that have state restrictions on them and just start chipping away at working with the state to get some waivers in place. I don't know if that list would be 25 or 125 or 2,000. Good interns, that'd be a good intern.
Seems to me like maybe it's not like we're going to go back and create some policy. I think there should be a definition of emergency, and an emergency that gives us the ability to suspend some of the land use rules. There's nothing worse than to not react, do the best that you can. And so what if you're going to be questioned about it at a later date? I would rather err in trying to save somebody's life, or control a situation than get dinged. I'll fight the fight 2 years later that says, well, you really shouldn't have used that piece of property because you didn't have the proper land. So come on.
No, that's actually that's a great point. I mean, why
So I think we should just put it in there and
exactly
challenge and give us
right in the finding that the whatever, and really the last thing we'd want to get bogged down with in an emergency would be dealing with these other, like I said, we could do land use rules, we could do other policies and codes. You could just say will be suspended or abridged as necessary to deal with the emergency. We'll deal with it later, because again, you don't want someone to be.
Take for instance another emergency. Let's just hypothetically say we have that massive earthquake. Well, we have all of our available public works folks that are technically being paid by road fund money. They got their equipment and they're lifting concrete blocks off of people and trying to save their lives. Most likely their checks are going to get cut out of the public works department, and we're acting within the ability that we have and the resources, and let's defend ourselves after the fact, but let's not sit around here and noodle. Well, should we be spending road funds, paying our road crew to use cranes and equipment that we have to save people's lives?
Well, and the other thing is if you do that, I mean, one of the things that you're doing is you are bringing that ultimate responsibility back to you and taking it off the people that are on the ground. You're right. I mean, if you authorized those folks to do that. So if someone comes back and complains about it, the person who won't be getting dinged is Steve or Marcia Miller or Howard Schuessler. It'll be you guys, because you made that decision to say.
But we're defending ourselves against land use, not against improper death.
I mean, I look at the situations where there's been massive earthquakes in other places, and they're digging out for days and days and days. And, I can see the administrator giving the authority, let's get our crews out there, we're expending our staff, and then we're going to come together as a body, and at some point we may be making the decision, all our professionals are saying that it's been 10 days and there's probably zero chance that there's any additional survivors. Then we're probably going to have to make the decision, we're going to stop spending resources there.
Well, I've got to tell you, when the sheriff calls me at 2 o'clock in the morning and he can't get hold of anybody else and lives are at stake, I'm saying go ahead on it. I think any one of them would do the same thing.
Right. I think that's just in our nature. Yeah.
So I think Dave brings up something that I really think is really important, and that is, I'd rather err on get the job done and then explain it later.
Right.
I think that hydrogen truck in Springfield was an example of that, where you had to make the call then, and based on the information you had. And let's say that we did make the call and something did happen and it wipes out, a half-mile radius. That's a lot of homes and people that are. So you inconvenience people for about 8 to 10 hours. What you did, diverting traffic and all sorts of things. Well, hindsight's always 20/20. Information comes back. Turns out we probably didn't need to, but you have the information there. You have to make a call, and I'd much rather err on that fact that you make the call now. And it was close enough to 9/11 that you're getting a call from Virginia, from Homeland Security, saying what's going on. So I think error on committing an error where, okay, maybe nothing happened, but you have to make a judgment.
Well, and
I'd rather explain it later.
And I think those are the decisions that you need to make ahead of time, and I think that's a great example. I mean, I don't think anyone would do this, but you'd hate to see the situation where, for example, the road fund is a good example. Because I know I know none of them are emergency situations, but we do bump into this with folks who say, oh, you can't do that because of this. Nobody even wants to have the debate at that time, let alone someone coming up later. You'd say, yeah, I knew that it was, that constitutionally we're only supposed to use this to build roads, but are you kidding me? We just had an earthquake. We have perfectly good equipment that could lift concrete on people. We're not going to let it sit there because it's not building the road. I guess we'll take that's on us.
Would you rather call 911 for heartburn or not call 911 for a heart attack? I'll take the heartburn shot.
So what I would propose is I could draft up some of these. Well, first of all, what do you think in terms of time? Is there some sort of, like, for example, it sounds like we've got the emergency like we could use the definition of emergency as incorporated in there, or a request for mutual aid if it's a level 1, up to, it sounds like there's kind of consensus for time, was that right, as opposed to the money? So, say 48 hours, and that to the county administrator or the person who's designated as acting county administrator, and that I would recommend that he immediately upon assuming that power or assuming that responsibility, that he try and immediately begin the process to organize or call an emergency meeting as soon as possible. So it didn't have to wait. I mean, you don't want anyone saying that you waited. Steve wouldn't do that, I know, but what you're saying is makes it clear, because he may be able to get you together in 24 hours.
Oh, yeah.
Or 12 hours or whatever.
He's going to notify us with a quick text or something when something's happened. And I would be surprised if we couldn't get together, less infrastructure's down and everything fairly quick. But, I don't know if
the likelihood of ever having to utilize this tool, I think, is very slim, right? We're preparing for a situation that is completely out of the ordinary.
Maybe, but I think Colorado probably thought that 2 years ago when 70% of their state burned out. So they probably thought the same thing. So I think it's important to, and you're right, it's probably unlikely, but they may have thought the same thing.
Yeah.
And we're kind of we're in the Colorado situation right now, so.
Did Baltimore probably realize that they were going to have riots to the level of riots recently?
Well, we're better off talking about it now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yep.
One thing I would say is I think the definition of emergency is important. The period of time is important. And then, what do we mean by allocation of resources? To me, I think allocating, you talked about the potential suspension of land use restrictions as appropriate, use of land, use of existing staffing resources and equipment that are fixed costs. I think in my opinion, if we're safer allowing for greater latitude on those things. I'm not sure that I think it makes sense to say there's no limit to the actual dollar amount, and so for purchasing services from contractors, I think that's something that the board should think about, because one of the things the administrator is going to be concerned with is what is our ability to pay. How much, I'm not going to want to overcommit if we don't have the ability to. So I do think you want to consider that. Do you really feel comfortable, regardless of the administrator, do you feel comfortable delegating authority for a blank check in the case of an emergency, or do you want to say you're more comfortable with saying, okay, well, you can allocate staff resources, equipment, and land, but we think that there needs to be some limit on purchase of services. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's an interesting decision point. That is good.
I like that. And the other thing, just to note, kind of put in the back of your mind, is the reimbursement rate on purchased services is better than the reimbursement rate on your own. For example, if you put your folks out there for overtime, the accounting requirements are mind-boggling, and they can only have had, certain amount of lunches, and it just gets crazy. Whereas if you bring in some contracted resources, the bill is the bill, and you get it, your reimbursement rate is much better. So that's just kind of an editorial comment. It's just good for people to know. I don't really know how this plays into what we're doing today.
That's good in case we have an emergency later on this week.
This was a good question, and it's something that and it's not because maybe a little bit of a guy in leadership here, but if you're asking, you're going to deploy our employees to do something that's outside their job class, there probably should be some conversation that the unions agree that this is, whether it's that voluntarily do the work, or there probably needs to be a mechanism that they think about, that they approve, and then in a situation like that, can we do a contracted billing instead of our normal way of billing where, this is a completely different situation, so.
Not if they're an employee. What I would suggest is that, it's all based on situation assessment, but perhaps the employees are used for continuity of government, like we try to keep the government running to the extent that we can, and we use contractors to be doing the things that are outside of the norm of their job class. Because then you've protected yourself, and you can get it, provided that it's not going to be a runaway check, your reimbursement rate from FEMA is going to be cleaner and more robust. But it's so much of this is based on what is the situation and what's the best decision based on what we're facing. That's the hard part.
The other thing that comes to mind as you talk about that I'd be concerned about, or that we need to be mindful of when we're crafting this, is the liability of the expo. So the Forest Work Camp is an example of, in that case, we were asked to hand over land for temporary use for staging an emergency. And I think we agreed as part of that process to language that limited our liability for use of the land a few days later. So, but I think that's something that we want to, at least from an operational response standpoint, the people making those decisions are going to want to be concerned about, okay, what is our liability? When you purchase a service, the bill is the bill, right?
Right.
You're paying for someone to go out and do that. When you're having existing employees go out and do things that might be outside of their class, when you're allocating land for use outside of what it was originally intended for, when you're using equipment for in special circumstances, are all things that bring liability issues into play.
Yeah, you really start going down the road. I'm thinking that, if they're being, if our employees were being asked to do stuff, they would be, certainly the represented people, I can't imagine that there wouldn't be a circumstance that would somehow be covered in their, in terms of overtime or whatever it is. I'm thinking, but they would still, even if they were being used as mutual aid, they would still be our employees, so we would still be owning them, if you will. Do you know what I mean? In the sense of if they got hurt, it would be our workers' comp. If there were a claim
brought against them as a result of what they did, that would be against us in the sense of the thing, the county would cover them. But I think what Steve is saying is, would we be saying to that other, like if Springfield said, can we use your public, I don't know, I have never seen their mutual aid agreement. Almost all the ones that I have seen have that mutual, that the requester is going to
Pay the bill.
they agree to represent and indemnify.
Oh, okay.
We're asking your people to come help us. If while your people are helping us, they engage in conduct that results in you being sued, we've got your back. Right? We're going to represent you. And it's not really even down to the individual employee level, because we would be obligated under the Oregon Tort Claims Act to cover them. But what it would mean is that we'd be talking, the other entity is agreeing up front, no, we're going to take care of that. Because that is the most common. It just seems right. Why would I come help you? I want to help you and everything, but if helping you exposes, our organizational liability, it seems only fair that if we're helping you, you should see that liability.
Right.
Because it acts as a big disincentive to providing help.
Right.
That's why no one would do it, because they'd say, well, I'm not going to send our people over there, because in addition to me giving you their time and buying the stuff, I'm also apparently buying liability.
Well, and I don't know how far the Good Samaritan law extends.
I don't really even have one here.
Okay.
The tort claim lawyers saw the end of that. But, yeah, I just think that those are all policy decisions that are best made up front.
I completely agree.
And I agree that I guess that's another one of those little aspects where if when we look at this, we determine that there is something that doesn't seem to be covered by, a collective bargaining agreement, then we would sit down and I guess it would be an MOU with the affected bargaining unit that would say this MOU gets activated when there's a level 2 or 3 emergency. So what would your timeline be? I know you want to get your thing approved before the end of June.
Yeah, which I'm really glad you're reminding me, because I've got to get the board order in so I can come see you guys again.
And then, because next week is a down week, right? And the week after that is the United States Open.
Yes, it is.
Which means I will be in Chambers Bay, but I've committed to wearing a Lane County T-shirt. Do some promo. I can. Do you want me? And I think we've done a lot of stuff last week. So Linda's got to get her thing done. If you just give me a timeline, I can certainly draft some of these things up and then circulate it so you can see them. And what I would propose to do is write them with some options for you. So you could, like it say, insert time here, insert amount, contracted authority here, those sorts of things, some of the decision points that we've made, so that when you get there, you could sort of prepare for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, if you're going to send something out, as long as people understand, don't start replying to all suggestions.
Yeah, no. I'm just saying it would be your, when I send that out, it would just be, the idea would be you'd look at those decision points and maybe, use it as your kind of scratch down yourself, like, this is what I do if it came up, and then you'd have to be ready to talk.
Well, it sounds like the important first step is for us to adopt the updated emergency operations plan. So, getting you on the schedule for that, and then this particular action is, if it could come close on the heels, particularly if it's going to make reference to that. So that the week after might be whenever Linda's ready, then kind of expect that we're going to want you to come back shortly thereafter.
I'd like to have an appendix, addenda, or they call it annex in the EOPs for some reason. I don't know where. I'll have to figure out where. I'd like to have it be a section that gets referred to in the plan, that section can get updated at any time, so it's very living, because the emergency operations plan gets updated, it's now mandated to be updated every 2 years instead of every 5 years, but if at some point in that 2-year period, you want to make some changes to that, I want to make it just take this page out, put this page in, so I'll have to think about how to reorganize the plan document a little bit, but I just want to say how much I appreciate this really good discussion, because this is something that we've needed to do for a long time, and for some reason, we now have the will to do it, so this is great.
And
Right up the table.
staring at a drought and many other things kind of motivates us, but it also just, I guess, some of the experience I brought in from being involved in an ICS a couple times and understanding just how hectic and trying to get decisions made when you haven't thought through things in advance can really be difficult to deal with.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
And like I said, I think it would be good, this would be good to have this, whatever you come up with, to have that automatic, or the renewal language, which would say that we put it on the calendar for every year at, in June or whatever, or May, it would come up, so you could look at it and say, are we still happy with this? Do we need to change it? Are we all good? Well, then let's just reauthorize it to go forward for another year, like you do with, sort of the other routine things like
We have a whole bunch
newspapers
of
and-
routine delegations of authority every January when we reconvene the board.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And this would just be a good one to
Add to it.
just add to it, and maybe something's happened where you go, oh yeah, well, we didn't think of this, or this didn't work in this situation, and then you can change it. But I think the important part, from my perspective, is that means that everybody that's currently on the board has had a chance to weigh in on it, because it's a pretty big delegation. It's important that everybody who's there, I think, freshly give that to the people, because that's really what Steve and the other employees that are going to be acting on your behalf, I think they're entitled to that answer. That they know that you've thought about it and that you're comfortable with that, giving them that authority, and that you're going to be ultimately responsible. Good?
Good.
Are they all right?
You guys got anything?
I do. I'll only speak to my experience. In the event of an earthquake, there's a plan to use public works crews. And the plan is that we inspect the infrastructure and bridges of Lake County. And we run the drills. Last time we ran the drills, it was 1,200 man-hours in perfect conditions. So you're going to have loaders and cranes, but you're not going to have operators, because we are going to be working our way. And that's all the bridges. It's set up in districts. So on Zone 2, which is Cottage Grove, we were inspecting I-5 bridges, county bridges, city bridges within certain areas. And there's maps. Basically, there's a binders in our shop that when we report in this emergency, it's you two go here, you two go here, you two go here. We go through this binder, and we hit those. So the plan is, in an earthquake, we're occupied, and I can see we're being occupied for 24 hours straight just to get through that system. We have hundreds of bridges inspected. And I know that the minute that happens, we go to the inter-operations channel on our, what we call the county radio, the large radio system that we have, and we're getting directions from some inter-operational agency, probably the Sheriff's Department and these guys. It will no longer be Delta dispatching us. We're being dispatched by another agency. So there's that. And like I said, that's strictly for earthquake. The other thing, too, is you have an asset that I would say, in my experience, is probably better than a text or cell phone, and that is that radio system we have. We push of a button. The system we have has a greater coverage than cell, and push of the button, and you can be, all of you can be in direct contact with LCS. Whether it's, what can I do for you, or we need you to make a declaration. It's another piece of hardware that you would need to have, but it would, I don't think you have to monitor it. It would be, oh, there's been a meteor strike, maybe I should get my radio and turn it on. And you would have direct contact with the roads department, sheriff's department, Homeland Security, everybody through that.
I think it goes farther than that. We should have repeaters with eWeb,
Or service.
or service, ODOT. It's pretty expensive.
Extensive. You would have all the information or communication you needed with that.
We could get you all pagers.
Wow. Don't laugh. I remember the day and age of carry one.
Only important people did that.
Yeah. But, one of the, it'd be great to supply us all with radios, but I do know that those digital and compliant radios now with the interoperability standards are about $8,500 a piece.
The ones that, those are for the, what do we call like a base unit? The handheld ones are about 15 to 2,000.
Is that
They won't reach me. Hawaii, for instance.
We said 15 to 20, but that's not bad. 15,000.
They will reach 50 miles off the coast, and they will reach Fairview Lookout. So,
So you could be fishing.
Better than cell coverage. So, that's just, I thought you might want to know.
Yeah.
Not Hawaii.
So,
Although you could look into it.
sounds like,
You get a repeater over there.
to kind of gather this back in, sounds like, legal counsel and our emergency operations manager, or is that, I don't know if that's the correct,
Emergency manager.
emergency manager, there we go, have their marching orders as far as what our expectations are and when they need to come back. So I appreciate everybody coming back this afternoon. I think we're down. I think that kind of finishes up that item. We could all sit here and swap stories for a while about emergencies. So I'm trying to bring us back to, I think we're down to review of assignments from the administrator.
So does this mean I am excused?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. You have
You can
to be
get back to
really
real work.
direct with me. Okay, great. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
There you go. Now you're talking.
We're almost at the end of the meeting.
Do we have authority to excuse you? I don't know.
Yeah. We'll work on
Do we need to declare an emergency?
And I'm so glad I didn't have to show you these maps. We'll save these for another time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I've seen them. They're up on the wall of the LCOG conference room on their 5th floor. It has all the fire districts. You can see where they don't protect areas. Pretty extensive. Mr. Mokahizky.
Mr. Chair, I just heard two things. The first was a request from Commissioner Stewart. We talked about the strategic plan to make sure that we're incorporating the next steps for federal funding, a forest management plan, and other goals into our strategic plan, which we will follow up and make sure we bring forward to you. And then Commissioner Lycan asked about the SWEDCO payments. I did have an opportunity to reach out to John Reese, the city manager in Eugene, and he indicated that yes, they have made the payment in the current fiscal year, and yes, my question was, has the city made its payment to SWEDCO in the current fiscal year, and has it budgeted the payment for next year? And the answers to both questions were yes. So we can follow up with the agency as well, but wanted to let you know that we do have an answer on that. Those are the only two things that I have.
Did anyone note any other assignments that were missed? Okay, and no executive session. Any other business for the board today? If not, then we will adjourn the board meeting, and we're down next week, so it'll be June 16th, 9 a.m.
So I just